Hey guys. Well, I'm in. Where am I? Sorry, I forgot for a minute. I'm trying to set myself up right here. I'm in Estonia. I am actually in a tiny home. Thought we would try a tiny home out because that's one idea we had for when we got back. Is apart from living in a camper van, of maybe creating tiny homes somewhere on the land somewhere. We shall see. But right now we're. This first Facebook Live I've done for a while, and traveling has just been too hard to do it. But I'm going to be sharing some information on the update, of like a review really, of the low carb, high fat Breckenridge thing 2008, the conference. And I finished last time on midway through diabetes, so I'm just going to finish that section on diabetes. And there's a guy called Christopher Webster. He's a PhD student with Tim Noakes, and if you've been involved in low carb for a while, you should know Tim Noakes. If you haven't, Google him. Tim, easy to say that, Noakes, N-O-A-K-E-S. Fantastic guy. And basically what Christopher did was he took a population of people who were self-selected, so they actually either were starting to be pre-diabetic or diabetic, and they decided themselves, because it's so popular in South Africa, to actually take themselves onto a low-carb, high-fat diet. And so it was a self-designed process. And it was interesting that the key experiences they had, he looked at the experiences, was the main thing was just a massive reduction in hunger. So when they had a massive reduction in hunger, what that meant is that particular food addictions were much, much easier to handle. And that all made it, it's not a surprise, more sustainable. So that whole idea of lowering carbohydrates being addictive and dangerous for us in terms of creating, they're little, if there was any of those little nasty Nomi things, whatever they're called, those would be them. And it was interesting, he did the study, and when he looked at their carb content, they were down under 64 grams of carbohydrate, which is actually quite high. It's above 50. Like a lot of people recommend beginning above 50, whereas Eric Westman, and I follow his ideas on this particular area, recommend starting below 20 in total grams of carbs, and you'll understand that from my previous talks. So, what it meant for those people, that they chose that themselves, which is fantastic, and then they feel more positive about their future because they can see they've actually got a future that doesn't have, that slow downhill path, I should go this way, that slow downhill path of diabetes complications, and they actually reversed. They got off a lot of drugs, either reduced them or got off them altogether. 7 participants appear completely diabetes free, so nothing, HbA1c back to normal, all good. So it's all good for diabetics. Interesting, the conference was started by a Kiwi, and she started with a Karakia. Those Kiwis out there will know what I'm talking about there. Catherine Crofts, and there's a guy called Dr. Joseph Kraft, K-R-A-F-T, and he's done a lot of research on how insulin responds to a meal in people's bodies. And he's got different patterns of response, and no one's really dug into that research that well. And he's unfortunately died. She managed to connect with him just before he died, and is starting to really dig into that research. So basically, it's kind of a watch this space kind of a process. And there is an idea that if you have a meal, and because we don't generally test for it, so one simple way to get a test is to have a meal and then test for like glucose, like instead of doing a fasting blood glucose, have a meal 2 hours before and then see what it's like. It's a bit of a cheeky way to do it, but it's a possibility. And so you want your insulin levels to be as low as possible at 2 hours. But there's more, basically, watch this space. So then we move into fats, and the really fascinating thing on fats they did at the conference are really good. I've put them all together in order, as I said before, rather than having them spread out through the conference. Because I wanted to focus on one macronutrient at a time, and I think that works better. So there's a guy called Andrew Mente, another PhD, and he looked at the PURE study, and there's been a lot of talk about the PURE study and how that supports the idea of the current recommendations of dietary allowances and stuff like that. But when you dig into that whole idea, the devil is in the details. When you dig into it properly, without any bias, then that's what Andrew Mente did. And he found out that reducing saturated fat, I'm just reading off my notes here, and replacing it with carbohydrate actually has adverse effects on blood lipids. So following the dietary guidelines has an adverse effect on blood lipids. And you can't look at LDL. That's what a lot of things look at in isolation. You can't do that. And so basically the current data are at odds with the recommendations. So he's part of a movement to change that. And he says a high carbohydrate diet, and that's anything over 50 to 55% of your total energy intake from carbohydrates, is associated with a higher risk of mortality. And if you're looking at a 20 grams a day, then you're much lower than that. You're more likely 5 to 10%, depending on your calorie loading. And but you've got a bit of leeway. But the current recommendations are around about 65% carbohydrate, and so that's way too high. And it's interesting that fats, including saturated and unsaturated fat, are associated with actually a lower risk of all-cause mortality. So that means that the higher your fat intake, the lower your death rate from all sorts of things come in. And that's where cancer takes a big part of the picture as well. And he said there's no association between total fat and types of fat and cardiovascular disease. So the idea of cutting down saturated fat in particular to avoid cardiovascular disease, there's no evidence for that. And then Nina came. I love Nina. She's a great journalist and she speaks really well. And she looked at the whole idea of the research they did to actually move from an animal fat-based diet to a vegetable fat-based diet, and largely because vegetable oils used to be used as engine lubricants. I'll let that sit in. If you didn't know that already, then Big Fat Surprise is her book, and they were going to call it something else, but the Big Fat Lie, but they didn't think they should actually do that, be more PC and call it the Big Fat Surprise. Basically, you want to avoid all vegetable oils, and that's that'll come through a bit clearer in Michael Eads' new work, which I'll talk about in a minute. But, tallow, suet, lard, butter were the original oils, what we've used for decades, or thousands of years. And she recommends, avoiding polyunsaturated. That's largely the vegetable seed oils. So canola oil, sunflower seed oil, sesame seed. Sesame seed oil, you keep that in the cupboard for a while, you'll smell the difference between fresh oil and unfresh oil. So that's all the oils oxidizing. For salad dressing, she recommends using olive oil, and then you have to get a really good olive oil. And Dr. Wallach, who I've worked with, his supplements, he recommends not using any olive oil at all unless you've pressed it yourself and you're having it very fresh. So that takes out most olive oils in the supermarkets for most people. For cooking using saturated fats, coconut oil has the highest burn point. Butter, if you use, something I learned from Dr. Wallach, that if you're heating butter in a pan, and it's very easy to do, that if you make it go brown, you're actually creating your own trans fats. You're actually oxidizing the fat right there. So if you're using butter and heating it, try not to just heat it to a level where it doesn't go brown. And avoid, fried food in restaurants. So that's Nina's big takeaway, is just, ask what it's cooked in, and then sometimes they won't actually know. But most restaurants, and I'm pretty sure this will be the same in New Zealand as well as anywhere else, will be, fried in vegetable oil. So all that, all the other oils and, baked goods in supermarkets and stuff like that. So it's really got and this is where Michael Eads really dug into it. And I just saw this week his book, Protein Power 1.0. He's just about to bring out 2.0. He's been caught up flooding in his house, like people have died around his area with massive floods and stuff like that. So he's been through a pretty major deal the last few months, I think. And but anyway, his new research is pointing to the idea that linoleic acid, which is one of the oils that fatty acids, which is an oil which comes in the vegetable oils, actually gets incorporated, because basically we use the oils that we eat and we incorporate them into our cell membrane. So just basically the whole idea of when you incorporate an oil into your cell membrane, it becomes part of the functioning unit of the cell, because that determines what goes in and what goes out. And the mitochondria, that's all the energy production happens around the inside of the cell membranes. And so if linoleic acid's in there, it can affect our mitochondrial function. So particularly the membranes, he's looking at the mitochondrial function and the function of the fat cells, like holding onto fat rather than releasing or something like that. So there's more research coming out on that, but those are the two main areas of membranes that he thinks linoleic acid affects. And so as well as cutting the carbohydrates, which is still a primary driver of health, then meticulously avoid linoleic acid and eat. So that means eating more at home, like getting away from restaurant food. A big thing, not so big for Kiwis, but a big thing for the more affluent nations, or the people that eat out, like the Americans. Even though a lot of them aren't affluent, sometimes the poorest people have the worst diets because they eat out at cheap places a lot. And eat more saturated fat, because saturated fat is really good for the health of our cell membranes. And so to give you an idea, like safflower oil, 78% linoleic acid, grapeseed oil, 73%, poppy seed oil, 70%, sunflower oil, 68%, hemp oil, 60%, a lot of that's getting popular these days, corn oil, 59%, wheat germ oil, 55%, cottonseed oil we don't really have, I don't think, 54, soybean oil 51, walnuts, interesting, 51, sesame 45, rice bran oil 39, and peanut oil 32%, and then it goes down from there. For example, egg yolk has like 16%, lard is 10%, olive oil is only 10% linoleic, so that's another plus for that. Palm oil is 10, cocoa butter is 3%, macadamia oil is 2%, so quite a difference between macadamia and walnuts. Butter 2% and coconut oil 2%. So it gives you an idea of go for more of those kind of oils in your diet rather than the other ones. We've covered, Peter Bruckner from Australia did a great section on sports and exercise physiology with low carb, high fat and ketogenic diets, and I covered that in a previous video, so I won't go into that. There was a bit of discussion, lively discussion actually happened with just the whole idea of fasting, particularly prolonged fasting, where you can die if you're actually coming off a really, really long fast. Some people just dig into it and just go on for weeks or months. And a famous Scottish guy did it for, I think, over a year or just around a year. I'm not sure. It was way up there. And he was doing it under some supervision, and he was getting supplementation and things like that. So, but he lost a lot in that time. But starting to eat again can cause a problem, because all your electrolytes go wrong. You can actually lose, sodium, potassium, and magnesium, and you get things coming out of the intracellular fluid that shouldn't be coming out when you start to re-eat. So that's what actually can knock you off. So if you're doing any prolonged fasting, you need to be careful with that. Do it under supervision, like in terms of working with a doctor, so he can respond to the bloods and stuff like that. And essentially, it causes dysrhythmia, so that your heart just skips beats and sometimes stops. So not a good look. So whereas Megan Ramos came on, and she's working with Jason Fung. If you haven't heard of him, he wrote The Obesity Code. He's a pediatric. No, he's an nephrologist. I'm not sure if he was a pediatric nephrologist, but worked with kidneys. And so he sees a lot of diabetic people come in because they get kidney disease. And so he's been on this journey for a long time. And so they do work. He's got a site called IntensiveDietaryManagement.com. And they a lot of great information there, particularly if anyone's looking at fasting, that's the site I'd recommend you look into. A lot of good free information there. But they're in their clinic, they deal with things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome, sleep apnea, which PCOS is often a cause of infertility, is one of the major causes in the world now. And a lot of benefit and with going low carb, high fat or ketogenic. Sleep apnea, that comes with being overweight, insulin resistance, cancers, neurological diseases like neuropathy, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, autoimmune diseases, and high performance athletes. So they deal with a wide range of people, and basically there's no one size fits all kind of fasting regime. They would recommend not looking at fasting. They do some psychological screening. So if you've had any food addictive issues or food avoidance issues, body image issues, then they would actually recommend you don't do any fasting, because it can be a self-perpetuating process. Again, being aware of the refeeding syndrome, and that's where having lots of salt, lots of minerals. That's where people like Stephanie recommends bone broth or bouillon cubes. So just to, even with light fast, to actually do that. I mean, I don't really do multi-day fasts, but I do intermittent fasting on a day-to-day basis. So I generally try to eat in an 8-hour window, which is quite a big window. That's like from, say, if you look at a simple way to look at it, from midday to 8 o'clock. That's where I get all my eating in at that time. That's quite a big window of time. Other people prefer to do like 2 or 3 hours kind of windows. But if on all the fasting, it's on top of a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic diet. So it's not designed as a eat normal, and then like Michael, gosh, I've forgotten his name. He's from the UK. He does a 5+2 fasting, where he kind of recommends eating relatively normally in the middle days. These are designed for eating low carb, high fat, ketogenic diets when you do eat, and then when you fast, it makes it fasting easier. So it goes along with it. Eric, always one of my favorite speakers on the low carb field, Eric Westman, he looked at a few studies, and one of them I thought was interesting was a mice study where they looked, because they've done experiments on worms where they expose them to beta-hydroxybutyrate in that's the main ketone body that comes from the breakdown of fats that you actually metabolize. And so they looked at that in a petri dish. So they had the worms slithering around on petri dishes, and they found they lived 20-25% longer than the ones without that on the petri dish. And there's not a lot of people willing to do human studies once a worm study has been effective, but when you do studies on mice, and that proved that this study proved that mice fed a ketogenic diet actually lived longer with less disease than their compatriots who weren't fed a ketogenic diet. Now that's getting closer to people wanting to do long-term human studies on it. So that's it was a really interesting highlight, really. When you get that kind of thing happening, then science starts to wake its mind up. There's a few other studies, and there was one great anecdote, a lady who'd had 2 bariatric surgeries. So she'd had one, lost a lot of weight, and then got fat again, like a lot of that happens. And then she had a second, the second one took as much as they could take out, and she couldn't get another one, but she did get fat again after that second one. And now, with shifting gear to a low-carb, high-fat diet, she's had the best weight loss ever. Now, that's just an anecdotal story, but it goes to show that that don't go get bariatric surgery, master diet first. He also gave a really good warning on a drug category called an SGL2 inhibitor. So what that does is it inhibits your kidneys from reabsorbing glucose. So basically, diabetes, one of the ways that they used to diagnose diabetes in the old days was the doctors used to taste the urine. And if the urine tasted sweet, then that means they got sugar coming through the kidneys. And so that's one way that the kidneys function to get sugar out of there. And so the SGL2 inhibitor basically stops that process. So your urine gets less sweet, you get less sugar peeing out. Not necessarily a good thing in itself, but I think it's a way to actually, reduce that process, because that creates a lot of problems in the kidney. I'm not actually sure what I can't remember what the issue is with that, but it means you would think if you inhibit that, then it would make your blood sugar lower. So I haven't studied that drug. As you know me, I'm not a drug favorite person, so I don't know why they would even want to do that. But there are people on those drugs, and if you go to, even in New Zealand, the MedSafe site, medsafe.govt.nz, if you Google or you search in there for SGLT2 inhibitor, you'll come across the drugs. There are dapagliflozin, empagliflozin, and canagliflozin. So FLOZIN is the end word. And so if you're on any of those drugs, make sure you stop them with medical supervision before you actually start a ketogenic diet. Because the reason why they found that is that you can actually have fairly normal blood sugars, but your ketoacidosis can happen. It's an abnormal ketoacidosis, and it can be lethal. So there are some warnings there on the New Zealand website. Eric Westman's warning about it. So, and I haven't known anyone on those drugs yet. But if you are on those drugs and you're thinking of going ketogenic, be aware of that point. And he's part of the obesity medicine group, and he's basically saying they're changing really slowly. So even though he's getting all these great results, and he's been getting them for 25 years, that whole obesity medicine is changing because there's so much money goes into bariatric surgery. And in New Zealand now, you can get that paid for by the government. So sad but true story. But in terms of their protocols, they see low carbohydrate, high fat ketogenic diets being a low calorie diet. So that's how it fits into their mind think. And the reason I think that's true is because when you do cut out carbohydrates like that, I said initially, you cut out the hunger. Excuse me. And when you cut out the hunger, you're just not eating as many foods. So you just don't eat as many calories. And anyone who's gone low carb, high fat, ketogenic, they'll know that they're eating a lot less than they used to. So it is actually a low calorie diet, but it's a satisfying low calorie diet, not a starvation diet. Let me see. And you can find that the Obesity Medicine have a website called obesityalgorithm.org, and you can find that on there. What I'll do is I'll put all these, I'll put this PowerPoint up, or I'll turn it into PDF so you can click on the links, because I've put links in there to everyone's sites. And this next one was really interesting. It was a guy called Benjamin Bickman, a PhD student, he's a PhD, and he's got a website called insuliniq.com, and he looked at the insulin-glucagon ratio. And if you know about that, they tend to work in a seesaw type reaction. So when insulin's high, glucagon's low, and they work against each other. And the question was around, he wanted to handle that question, does a high-protein diet affect ketogenesis? So does it raise your blood sugar enough so that it takes you out of ketogenesis? So one thing he found is that when you have a high carbohydrate diet, yes, extra protein does do that. And that makes sense because, you're just, hang on, I'm just getting pins and needles in my hand from holding this up. I think I'm supposed to look at that wee guy there, so I'll try and use this moment to focus in on that. There we go. There we go. I'm putting my elbow on the arm of the chair, so it gets into that nerve. So yeah, when you have a high carbohydrate diet, your body's got to deal with carbohydrates, so it's not going to do anything more with protein than just turn it into extra protein than turn it into sugar, because it can't burn it for fats. And the more basically the more glucose in your body, or the more insulin you've got in your body, because if you're a hyper responder to glucose, like if you've got metabolic syndrome, you've got all that idea of having too much insulin in your blood, hyperinsulinemia, then the more careful you need to be with protein at the beginning. So as your blood sugars come down and your insulin levels come down, then you can relax on protein. But if you're on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, then you don't need to worry so much about protein. So you can actually, remember we talked about protein being the satisfaction food, that you need to eat enough protein to feel satisfied, so then you're not craving carbohydrate, because if you don't feel satisfied, you'll tend to shoot for carbohydrates because they're a quick fix. So it was really great to see that the research is showing that if you're on a low carb, high fat diet, then you can eat more protein and feel more satisfied. And I thought that was some really great research. Nina came in and talked about that, because there's been a whole, you'd have to be living in a cave to not realize that red meat's been demonized for a long time and still is in the press. So when Nina dug into that research, and her video is now available on YouTube, so I'll find a link for that and put that in here. But basically there's been there's no causative factors linked between red meat and cancer, cardiovascular disease, or all-cause mortality. So when you dig into the research they've got is useless research. It's crappy research. They've just and there's so many co-founders there, so they look at people self-assessing how much they eat, and there's a lot of things like that. People that eat a lot of red meat often smoke. So there's all sorts of things go on that they really can't control for in those kind of epidemiological studies, and you really can't draw those conclusions. But when you look into the other research like Nina's done and dug in a bit more, red meat has no significance in terms of cancer, cardiovascular disease, or all-cause mortality. Another interesting thing she said for me is that when she dug into the nitrates and nitrites issue for things like bacon and stuff, they're not really seen as an issue. So that was a new information for me, because I've been holding back on those kind of things because I love bacon, and at the same time I'm looking for nitrate-free bacon. Very hard to get when you travel, so I've been limiting my bacon intake, and I don't know if I'm completely free with it yet, but my mind is a little easier on it. So if that helps you as well, that's great. One of the main things that Nina's focusing on is the idea of changing the dietary guidelines, because what she says, and it's true, that people who are saying that we're getting fatter and the disease is increasing is because they've told us what to eat and we're not following the rules. And when you look at the actual data, we're following the rules really, really, really well. We love to be on the right side of things. We don't like to hurt ourselves in general. We like to be doing the right things. So we all follow the guidelines. And so we see, saturated fats come down, carbohydrate intake, whole grains have gone up, vegetable oils have gone up, and that's all supposed to be healthy and in the guidelines. So what she's saying is that until we actually get the guidelines changed, people will, you've come across this yourself probably. You think, well, this is what we're told is healthy, and these guys out in left field here are saying something else. So maybe they're wrong. Maybe I should be trusting these other guys. And the truth is no, absolutely not. And so there is a new change in the guidelines happening in 2020, which is only like a year and a bit away. And she's doing a major fight to really get those guidelines changed. And she's got a good site focused on that called nutritioncoalition.us. I'm not sure if you can do a lot in other countries to support her, but great thing to do. I know Karen Zinn, the dietitian, and Professor Grant Schofield's doing quite a bit to push that whole change in New Zealand culture. So all power to them. I'm just beginning to wrap up the series here. Rob Wolf, he's a long-time primal guy. Rob spelled R-O-B-B, robwolf.com. Wolf is in the animal. He came and talked about the needs to be metabolically flexible, the whole idea that his wife can deal with more carbohydrates than he can. There's no definite number for anyone. And he talked an interesting thing. He'd studied the Inuit and there's research from them, and they actually have a gene which actually makes it harder for them to get into ketosis. So they get more blood sugar raising from protein than we do. So that's an interesting thing given what they've had to deal with in their lives. Whereas the Kitavans are an island group in the tropics, that they can eat 60-70% carbohydrate diet. But when you test them, like with a blood glucose test, they can clean up their blood, like their 2 hour or 1 hour blood glucose level is about 85 grams, I think, whereas we think normal in a 2 hour blood glucose, this is after a meal, is 120 or less. And so basically their response to a glucose load is actually a lot better than us, and they can get the blood glucose back to normal a lot faster. So they're often set out as an example for the fact that, well, if these guys can eat, these guys have a primitive diet that's high carbohydrate, so it should be us, maybe the low carb idea is wrong. Well, it's just their response, and they have a better response than us, and we can't extrapolate that to us and particularly if you have eaten a high carbohydrate diet, high simplified carbohydrate diet, because they have a more complex, because they're eating vegetables and fruits, then we've ruined our metabolic process. But at the same time, they may have a different one in the beginning, just like the Inuit have a different process around production of ketones. The Kitavans may have a different genetic process behind theirs as well. So you can't use that to basically extrapolate that it's okay to eat a high-carb diet. He talked about multi-generational, so I need some water, multi-generational epigenetic changes. We've talked about this before, the idea that what you eat can affect the genes of your progeny and generation for generation for generation. And we're seeing, that's showing like people who, say diabetic mums, people go into the diabetes you get in pregnancy, gestational diabetes, their babies are more likely to be metabolically damaged and get diabetes themselves. So we see that imagine that going through down generations and generations. So now they think that part of the reason that children are fatter now is not just because we've changed the dietary, the food profile, but actually that genetic change is kicking in as well. So another good motivation, if you want to preserve the human species, is to start changing now, so we can actually turn the tide, so we can actually get the next generations doing better. His prescription was pretty general. Make sure you get lots of good sleep, and that's because of the stress hormones that happens when you don't get good sleep. And I've talked about this before, about the idea that the stress hormones may have more to do with cardiovascular disease than any other hormone. Make sure you get enough sunlight, vitamin D, natural sunlight. A bit hard when you're in this kind of northern hemisphere winter to do that. Get a little bit of sun on your face, and that's about it. Handle the gut issue, and I think there's probably more about gut than I think needs to be done. Because for me, I know when you change your diet, your gut microbiota change quite quickly anyway. So changing your diet should change your gut microbiota. Lifting weights is good. The whole thing we talked about in the physical exercise section, the whole idea that lifting weights is better than doing just exercising your heart. That whole idea of cardio, you want to limit that to a degree and increase the weight section. So you're not going to get, because you'll actually decrease often the volume of the muscle, because you decrease the fat in the muscle, but so your muscles get more tuned, so you're not going to look like Muscle Man, so you don't have to worry about that if that was an issue. It's just doing some resistive training is good. Body weight exercises is good if you haven't got any weights around or don't like the gym. And go slow with the changes. Go direct and immediate with the carbs, but go slow with your other changes, and look forward to some new experiences. So that was his whole process. And one thing I did like, that the diabetics use a blood glucose meter, so they look at their blood glucose before and after they've eaten, and that's something that anyone could do, even who aren't diabetic. Go buy a blood glucose meter. I might do this when I get home, and check out your blood glucose response to specific foods, and that's one way you can actually stop kidding yourself. And I thought that was actually really good, and see which foods trigger you, and particularly test those ones. So I thought that was a really good addition to the process. Aaron Kay talked about the Western price principles, that the whole idea where organic is better than non-organic food, grass-fed's better than grain-fed food, obviously. Organ meats are really good, and veggies should be sprouted or fermented, because there's a whole argument of whether we should be eating veggies at all. Or if we do eat them, we eat lots of sprouted ones, because as veggies have anti-nutrients, and sprouting or fermenting them gets rid of that. The whole idea that deficiencies can happen even on a low-carb, high-fat diet was talked about there, and that's one of the reasons I supplement, because no matter how good a food is grown, if the minerals aren't in the soil or are given to the animal. I once asked Doc, well, if we're supplementing cows with selenium, like New Zealand soils are very low in selenium, and if you're supplementing with selenium, shouldn't that get through to you? And he said, yeah, but you'd have to eat about 20 pounds of meat a day. And it just shows you, that kind of, you're not going to get the levels you need just from eating. Great talk by Mark. And so just to wrap it up, there's two speakers here. Mark is an MD. He's a professor of family medicine. He works in a small hospital in West Virginia, and he's been able to get the whole hospital on board with creating low-carb food. He's been training the cooks, so top to bottom down, and he's had people, nurses and stuff, get onto his program, the low-carb, high-fat program, and they're now educating the patients. And it's just a fantastic approach, where in a big hospital you just can't do that. He said you do need to get the upper echelons of the hospital and the people that control the money to see the value in that. So they took all the Coke machines out, and the Coke's only allowed to put in water and Diet Coke and stuff like that. But they changed the food, and they've changed the attitude to low carb, high fat throughout the whole hospital, and people are getting results and seeing each other get results. Isn't that a fantastic use of a hospital? So Mark Cucuzzella, I don't know how I'm pronouncing that right, so you can Google him, Cucuzzella, Mark Cucuzzella. And fantastic thing. And Andreas Infeld, thedietdoctor.com, probably the world's premium, low carb, high fat site, left being a GP to actually focus on the site, and is now doing extremely well. And he's doing a lot to change the world. And he says, that despite the amazing mistake that was made, and despite the overwhelming evidence that shows that it was a mistake, that there's a major resistance to change. And so that's where change is happening slowly. But he says there is nothing more powerful. I think, who was that? Mary, she was an anthropologist who wrote that. Nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And his website and other websites and all this information like I'm speaking about here, it's part of the change. It's got to be a bottom-up change. Nina's looking at changing the dietary guidelines, so that's where it comes from top down, but largely it's us changing and demanding change that makes it. There's a lot of Q&A, and there was one Q&A he was part of that I really enjoyed his answer to something, and it was the idea of carb cycling. If you listen to people like Joseph McCullough, he'll be saying it's good to cycle in and out of ketosis. If you think about it, we would have been in ketosis most of the time, and then when we were at the end of the summer, coming into the winter, when there was lots of berries and stuff, you might have gone out of ketosis, or there was honey. You could, invade a fight with the bees and get some honey, invade the bees' territory on that one. Then you might have gone out of ketosis, but he's talking about the idea of periodic cycling out of ketosis being good for you. And there's a question mark around that. And I really liked Andre's answer, very simple and to the point. And again, it's just all anecdotal. No one's got the right story on this, and more research needs to be done. But I like the idea that he related it to alcoholism, Andreas did. And so the idea is that, well, would you think an alcoholic would be healthier if they cycled in and out of having alcohol or not? And so that's the same thing with us about carb cycling in and out of ketosis. I'll let you answer that question yourself. And so there we are. That's part 2 review. And I hope you enjoyed that. And next time we'll get back to some shorter videos. And I'm not sure from where that'll be. Possibly Krakow or Portugal. Okay. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.